next argument was, so first he appealed to evil, which deductively proves that God exists. And then the second data point was knowledge and rationality. So do you want to explain what his argument was?
Yeah, so the rationality portion of that argument was the claim that because I am a compatibilist, well, his point essentially is that if determinism is true, which he assumes is true if atheism is true, if determinism is true, then it follows that any decision, belief, any possible cognizing of any sort is determined and cannot thereby be rational. And I just gave the rather, I think, pretty obvious counterexample that computers are like the archetypal example of a determined yet rational process. And so there's nothing incompatible about those. And yeah, his second argument, or the knowledge argument rather, was essentially.
Oh, and just a side point, like you mentioned during your statement. Okay, so you might say, "Oh, computers were designed."
Yes,
and it's like, okay, yes, they were designed, but that was not the point. The point was that like rationality and determinism are actually compatible.
Yeah, pointing out the fact that computers are designed is dialectically irrelevant when the point I'm responding to is the incompatibility claim. But yeah, the other argument, the knowledge argument, was essentially an interesting version of of Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism.
An interesting version of it.
Yeah. I mean, like for the first time someone hears that argument, they think it's obviously false because true beliefs are obviously going to be more adaptive.
Yeah.
Right? That's essentially the argument he gave, or the argument that response would apply to, right? He gave like I hate to say it, but like the most surface level reading of that argument. And I think that the vast majority of responses to the evolutionary argument against naturalism, at least like the ones that are like off the cuff, like the ones that people hear they hear that argument for the first time, this is where they jump to as an objection. Most of those objections are, I think, wrong-headed. Planning is pointing to a much deeper problem about the content of beliefs and the way that that's connected with the behavior, because that's what natural selection selects for, is behavior. So long as your body parts are in the right area to secure the resources, to survive, to reproduce, that's all that matters on naturalism, or on natural selection. And so Planting is making this like really interesting claim, and it's a claim that is a part of an argument that has spewed 20 to 30 years worth of a rich literature that's fascinating and touches on a lot of interesting questions. But the version he presented was one that can simply be responded to by saying, well, true beliefs are obviously more adaptive. Like that was really confusing to me. So in my response, I responded to his rather surface level interpretation of Plantinga, and then I did what I thought was a relatively fair reading of what Plantinga was actually saying, like the real deep problem that he thinks exists on a naturalistic view. And then I responded to that with, some arguments that I find compelling in the literature. And never was this addressed. I don't know. It seemed to me like the argument sounds really powerful when you're dealing with someone who's not familiar with the actual complexity of the argument. If you're talking to a guy who's a brand new atheist and you're like, but naturalism, it only selects for behavior, not true belief. And so I can identify a bunch of beliefs that can be adaptive and yet false. And therefore you don't get to call your belief in naturalism knowledge, or you can't justify it. You have a defeater for it. Okay, that's cool, but that's literally the lowest possible version of that kind of argument. And so I just found that surprising.
Is there anything else you want to say about that argument? Because you did address, like you said, you you addressed Eric's argument and you said, maybe, you know, what he's getting at is like you like ultra steelman the argument where you like you addressed a version of the argument that he didn't make. Your ending statement did get cut a little short. Is there anything else you wanted to say about that argument?
Yeah, so there is so the way in which I responded to it was, as you said, I responded to his initial kind of surface level interpretation of the argument, and then I said, but Plantinga is saying something way more interesting over here. Let me tackle that. And so then, I mean, you have various, I mean, like I was saying, the literature on this is vast, and I'm sure there's going to be objections to what I'm saying here. But it's at least interacting with the literature where you're saying, you could say, okay, well, on certain views, say like non-reductive views of like physicalism or what have you, you're going to have belief content that when paired with certain desires is going to lead to some behavior rather than another type of behavior. So it's going to lead to specific behavior, right? And insofar as that behavior is adaptive, that content is going to kind of latch on to the outside, to the real world, essentially. And so there is a sense in which natural selective pressures do bear on the content of beliefs. That's a very obviously quick run through that idea, but one of the other responses that I give to the evolutionary argument against naturalism that comes up later in the debate, I gave that was inspired by Oppie. He does this objection line. It's like his go-to. So Oppie makes this interesting observation that if we talk about, if we limit R, which is in the argument, it's talking about the reliability of our cognitive faculties. If we limit that to talking specifically about our metaphysical beliefs, then we can ask the question, okay, well, how, what is the data on the ground when it comes to metaphysical beliefs? Well, it seems like there's just vast disagreement among persons, among like your regular everyday people. There's vast disagreement among professional thinkers on these issues. So Oppie says that, hey, look, at least with regard to our metaphysical beliefs, it's quite obvious that that R is low, that the reliability of our cognitive faculties to produce true metaphysical beliefs is actually going to be pretty low. So when we establish that empirical claim, then he's going to say, okay, well, the probability of R is low. The vast majority of our supernatural beliefs or metaphysical beliefs held by most people that have ever lived are false. But then you can say, okay, well, what's the probability of reliability of those metaphysical beliefs and in conjunction with theism? Well, that's going to necessarily be either equal to or less, right? Because you're adding a claim to the initial R, right? So you're saying R in theism, we've already said R is low, so R in theism is going to be low. It's going to be equal to or lower than that original R. But then you can say, okay, well, if that's the case, then given that the probability of R and T is very low, but then Eric, of course, wants to say that the probability of our reliability of our metaphysical beliefs on theism is very high. And if we do that, then it follows that the probability of theism is very low, if that makes sense. So you kind of start with that empirical claim, you join it with theism. It cannot be more probable than the already low empirical claim. And then when you take the fact that Eric wants to presumably argue that the probability of our reliable metaphysical beliefs is high on theism, then it follows necessarily that the probability of theism is very low. So that's Oppie's kind of go-to objection to the evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Yeah, I also wonder if there's like an understated evidence point to be made there, where it's like, oh, well, under theism, you might say, well, we have these, reliable faculties. We do in fact have reliable faculties. We do in fact have knowledge. And you say like, okay, well, let's look at our metaphysical beliefs. Like, if theism were true, would you really expect us to be as unreliable as we are.
Yes, exactly,
Like,
exactly.
There's some general fact of like, oh, we have knowledge. We have, like we're not totally like we are tracking the truth. And you say like, but we're subject to cognitive biases. We like make all these mistakes. There are all these problems with our faculties, and it's like, why would you expect that on theism?
And you go back to the fall, right? Eric's going to posit the fall here, and he's going to talk about the noetic effects of sin, right? As Plantinga does. But the noetic effects of sin is just a vague concept that says like, okay, well, it affects all parts of the person, and so it's going to affect your cognitive capacities as well. But that doesn't really give us any predictive claim about how those are going to consistently fail and how they are going to be reliable, right? Like, there's clear distinctions to be made here, and it seems as though the kind of explanations that a natural selection kind of explanation, an evolutionary explanation for the kinds of beliefs we would expect, is going to be far more satisfying because it's actually going to have some predictive value here. It's a predictive power with regard to the ways in which we consistently fail versus the ways that we are generally reliable, right? We would expect that we're going to be generally reliable when it comes to medium-sized objects that we can interact with all day long. But metaphysical beliefs, of course, why would we expect we would be reliable on that? On theism, you'd expect our metaphysical beliefs to be very powerful. In fact, those are more important than the everyday middle-sized objects belief.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point. Like, there can be, like, we can get a story from, like, evolutionary psychology of, like, okay, we seem to be very reliable in this area where it seems to have some adaptive value, and we seem to be very unreliable in this other area that doesn't have adaptive value. Yeah. But if you're explaining it evolutionarily, that makes perfect sense. But if you're explaining it through the noetic effects of sin, through the fall, then it's like
a broad, undifferentiated claim that makes no real content to it.
No, yeah, and it's like it also wouldn't lead you to expect reliability and unreliability to track very specifically with the predictions of evolutionary biology. It's like, that's a huge coincidence. Yeah. No, it should be affecting everything across the board, right?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.